I am Ted Cooley, and this is lecture number 8 of the series on Zinn's collection book, The People's History of the United States. This would be chapters 15 and 16 in this book and my response to it. Chapter 15, following the armistice which ended World War I, the wartime spending, which had enriched the workers and farmers, came to an end. In the next decade, the stock market reached new highs before the general bust of 1929. However, the agricultural depression, which followed the end of the war in 1919, never recovered. So the farming community was already very stressed even before the collapse of 1929. Labor unrest swept the country in 1919 with the slowdown of the economy following the end of the war. The various immigrant communities were deliberately played off against each other, with African Americans brought in as strike breakers when other means seemed to falter. The socialist movement, present before the war, was in disarray, so committed communists became labor leaders in many of the strikes. Most of the strikes were broken up by police or the army presence, though a few captured small pay or hourly gains. There were strikes throughout the nation in a period of unrest in 1919 in Western Pennsylvania. Some 35,000 steel workers were out at one time. The South saw strikes as manufacturing, particularly in the garment industry, which had moved south to avoid already established industrial locations in New England and their unions. From 1900 to 1920, there were 14 million immigrants to the United States. Early in the 1920s, a major change in immigration, the top of the chart, favoring English immigrants in Northwest Europe, were passed by Congress and signed into law. This was filled with quotas showing racial prejudice as part of the policy of the federal government, a policy of certain political figures which has not changed. This did slow the growth of new immigrants, for which there were simply no jobs available. From 1922 to 1929, wages increased at 1.4% a year, while stocks increased 16.4% a year. While 42% of the families in this time period made less than $1,000 a year, the richest 0.1% made the same total amount. The same very wide gap between the very rich and the poor, which had preceded other financial panics, was again taking place. The roaring 20s, quote unquote, were underway for the richest, while the others were trying to survive. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, quote, "It was a borrowed time anyway. The whole upper tenth of the nation living with the insolence of a Grand Duke and the casualness of chorus girls," unquote. The darkness under this was the revival of the KKK, with an estimated 4.5 million members by 1924, entering the North as well as stronger in the South. In 1928, the Millen Plan, the Secretary of the Treasury, I believe, by the richest man in the country, resulted in a tax cut from 50% on income tax for the richest to 25%, while the poor were reduced from 4% to 3%. The next year, things crashed, with one economist commenting that the economy was unsound. Within weeks, 5,000 banks closed. The decade of the Great Depression had begun. In 1932, the many veterans of World War I who had been promised a bonus for their service came from throughout the country to petition Washington. They were camped about the mall and particularly on the east side of the Anacostia River in the eastern part of the District of Columbia. President Hoover sent in the army under the command of General Douglas MacArthur to clean out these veterans. Excuse me. What records we have indicates that MacArthur enjoyed the job, but Major Eisenhower, the second in command, had serious reservations about the whole method of using the standing army against citizens peaceably protesting government policy. With the election of FDR in 1932, some improvement in the legal framework for workers gradually took place. According to Zinn, the motivation was not in favor of the workers, simply that something had to be done. The National Recovery Act, declared unconstitutional in 1935, had two purposes. First, to stabilize the situation, and secondly, to make necessary changes in order to avoid the possibility of a true revolution. This gave the president great powers, though FDR delegated most of the activity of the NRA to other persons in the government and business community. The rural areas did not feel the anger of the industrial section, using very large home gardens and barter within their communities to feed themselves, though the darning of socks and patching of clothes took on new meanings. Some limited assistance was provided for families where documented disabilities prevented even a search for employment. Kansas still had the poor home system, the county farm, at least in Brown County, as late as 1980. Industrial strikes increased in 1934 and 35, with the CIO, an industrial union organization, finally separating from the craft-based AFL. This changes the system of labor organization for decades to come. A new development in 1935 was the set-down strike in a rubber plant in Akron, Ohio, where the workers remained in the facility so strikebreakers could not enter and control the means of production while keeping production stopped. The same year, the National Labor Relations Board was established, though at first it seemed to be a tool of management. The full extent of the power of the sit-down strike was the 40-day-long strike at the General Motors Fisher Body Plant, lasting from late fall 1936, early spring 1937. The effectiveness of the sit-down strike was shown in 48 strikes in 1936 and 477 in 1937. Additional legislation went through Congress to answer some of the worst abuse of the workers. In 1938, the 40-hour week was established, as was the beginning of child labor laws. Not all of the working public received these rights. My father worked a 48-hour week as a mechanic into the 1960s, when it was reduced to a 44-hour week, half days on Saturday. Social Security became established during this time, though the enrollment was very limited for years. Neither of my grandfathers received Social Security, as they were farmers during their working years. My mother, crippled with first the Spanish flu and later TB of the bone, and totally unable to perform in the workforce, had to wait 14 months to age 60 to draw her deceased husband's Social Security. There was no other program at that time to assist, though my sister, living in the home and working, managed to get the two of them through until the Social Security could be received. There were a few creative activities during these years, with the various federal projects in writing, art, and other fine arts produced some items really worthy of preservation. I knew a railroader in Raton who posed for one of the murals in the Schiller Theater while he was a young man seeking to establish enough seniority with the railroad to have a permanent job. Fortunately, the community has preserved this art as well as restoring the theater. The Writers Project for New Mexico is still a good source of historical information, not always commonly accessible on some of the rural areas of the state. These public work programs preserved and enriched many communities. Also, the CCC program for young men provided jobs, ecological restorations, and physical fitness preparation, which helped when called for service in the Second World War. Chapter 16. This chapter is the most slanted as far as its condemnation of American imperialism. Missing is any reference to alternative information, most glaringly Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. Actually, this time of American imperialism is completely within the historical lines of the country. From part of the motivation of the War of 1812 being to capture Canada, to the arrested presence of U.S. financed mercenaries who stormed ashore in Venezuela during the term of the current president. The alliance of the Allied powers during World War II was one of necessity rather than convenience and common interest. Neither Soviet Union nor the Western powers trusted each other. It was just that the common enemy of Hitler was a more pressing matter. Hence, compromises were made which had impacts not appreciated at the time. Free French support was granted with the promise of continued support of their colonial possessions, despite Ho Chi Minh being our ally against the Japanese. We double-crossed Ho, after the war, which brought us into Indochina 2 decades later to our sorrow. There were 4 spies in Los Alamos during the war, possibly 5, though only 1 is mentioned. David Greenglass was a machinist working on the lenses for the implosive device. His information may have been the least sensitive of the informants, though I believe this information is still classified. His sister and brother-in-law, dedicated communists, took the rap for his spying, being executed for his crimes to meet the public demand for blood. Zinn's questioning of this punishment is certainly justified. Klaus Fuchs came from the British Uranium Research Project. With all of the British scientists, his clearance was not adequately examined. This was an error, though the British were our allies in this project. He eventually settled in East Germany after the war, with Putin being recorded as one of the few attending his funeral services years later. He might have provided the most information to the USSR. Zinn makes no mention of him. Ted Hall was the non-ideological of the spies, believing that the U.S. should not be the only power in the world possessing this knowledge. He finally self-identified in recent years. This might have been after Zen published. Oscar Seaboarder was only identified in 2019 as having been an active spy in Los Alamos. There was another scientist probably involved at a high level of access to the secret information, but he lost his life in a radiation accident in the late 1940s with no proof of activity, though he had fought with the left in the Spanish Civil War. None of the above were mentioned by Zim as to their active involvement in violation of oaths and betrayal of government secrets. There is the undocumented assumption by many that part of the motivation for our usage of nuclear devices on Japan, while the U.S. knew Japan was already trying to surrender, was much against the perceived future threat from the Soviet Union as from the actual attempt to avoid a land invasion of the Japanese islands. There was a strong non-left peace movement during World War II, despite Zen's lack of mention of it. Eleanor's uncle, Gibson Winan, a professor of physics at the University of Wisconsin, was invited to Los Alamos, but declined because of his opposition to the war. The wife of a bright seminary professor, Alberta Lunger, in the mid-1960s, was active and had been active in peace movements for many years. The Christian response to armed conflict was strong in the, quote, peace, unquote, churches as well. This anti-war position from faith rather than from political ideology is totally missing from this chapter of the book. A cynical analysis by the poet Archibald MacLeish, as told by Zen, was that the post-World War economy will be more prosperous because, quote, the peace we will make, the peace we seem to be making, will be a piece of oil, a piece of gold, a piece of shipping, a piece in relief, without moral purpose or human interest, unquote. Though Zen goes at great length to show how the combination of big business and the political establishment sought to establish dominance following the close of World War II, there is no mention of such leveling actions for all people as Truman's integration of all the military forces in 1948. The presidential apology for the internment of the Japanese would come later in 1988, but it came. The Soviet Union, in a huff, proposed or otherwise, walked out of the UN in 1950, not being present when North Korea invaded the South. Conveniently out, with its veto power not usable, the Soviet Union played let's you and him fight while they could continue the hard job of repairing their country after the massive losses in personnel and industrial structure during World War II. This may have been an attempt to weaken the West while restoring the Soviet Union's military power. The winning United Nations forces did not stop, as the UN had stated in its conflict authorization, at the previous boundary, but continued on until the closeness to China brought in their forces. The Soviet Union still avoided any combat role. There is a report that the Soviet Union did not have an accurate census until the 1960s, as their losses in World War II were so great. In the early 1950s, the United States was distracted, if that's the right word, by Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, finding a communist under every rock he examined. Only recently has the misinformation from Washington approached the standard he established in his witch hunt for, quote, subversives, unquote. Finally, he was confronted by a public figure who called shame on his activity. Have you no shame? So that some limit was finally placed on his activity. The anti-communist crusade continued, though it finally became so out of proportion to reality that some humor was used to rebut some of its excesses. One of the protest folk songs of this era spoke of the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. I quote his chorus: HUAC, HUAC, what a wonderful thing it is for you and me that our freedoms are well guarded by politically retarded men of unimpeachable integrity, unquote. The buildup of military strength continued, in part because the United States lacked adequate knowledge of the real strength of the Soviet Union, grossly overestimating their abilities. In one victory parade in Russia, in Moscow, the overflight of the Soviet bombers were magnified by having the same bombers fly over again, only in different formation, so that our observers could count them twice. The U-2 flights tried to correct this information until Powers was shot down. It was only with Eisenhower's open skies proposal and the pointless nature of trying to shoot down all the photo satellites that a reasonable understanding of the overkill capacity of the United States and the Soviet Union could be realized, resulting in a lessening of the international tension between the two powers. This concludes chapters 15 and 16. Thank you.